Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to speak at Stockholm FinTech Week and to speak about one of my very favourite topics. I'm Dr. Sian Lewin, co-founder of RegTech Associates, a research company which uses our analysis to provide strategic insight and advice to our clients in the RegTech market. In October 2014, the chief economist of the Bank of England laid out his vision of how the surveillance of the global financial system could work. He said, "I have a dream. It is futuristic, but realistic. It involves a Star Trek chair and a bank of monitors. It would involve tracking the global flow of funds in close to real time from a Star Trek chair using a bank of monitors, in much the same way as happens with global weather systems and global internet traffic. Its centerpiece would be a global map of financial flows, charting spillovers and correlations." Like all futuristic dreams, technology is at the core of Haldane's vision. The ability to monitor in real time all of the financial transactions in the world to spot systemic risks or market issues before they crystallize. This would require cloud computing due to the vast data volumes, complex predictive analytics using artificial intelligence, and intuitive and configurable user interfaces. Luckily, there are already solutions out there making use of these very technologies to help regulated firms manage all sorts of risks and regulatory obligations. RegTech. And RegTech, I believe, has the transformative power to achieve Haldane's vision, but to do so will require concerted, collaborative effort between all of those in the regulatory system: policymakers, regulators, regulated firms, market infrastructure players, and governments. The interrelatedness and complexity of today's global financial markets necessitates that regulation is performed by a system, not by a single actor. And we must begin to think of RegTech as a fundamental part of this system if it is to achieve its full potential. So in this keynote, I'm going to do three things. The first is to provide some clarity about what RegTech is and what RegTech isn't, including the types of problems that RegTech can solve today. I'm also going to take stock of where the RegTech market currently is, using a proprietary RegTech database and research. And the third is to explore some growth areas for RegTech, what the future of the industry could look like, and what is needed to help it get there. So let's start by doing a little bit of level setting by what we mean by RegTech. At its very simplest, RegTech is a contraction of the phrase regulatory technology. But what does that mean? Essentially, RegTech is a label used to describe technology solutions that help regulated firms meet their regulatory obligations. And RegTech solutions apply across a number of highly regulated industries, from the energy sector through to life sciences through to the financial industry. And it's in the financial services sector where we've seen the most traction to date, largely as a result of the conflation of two key factors. The first is the wave of regulatory change following the financial crisis, the veritable alphabet soup of new regulations: MiFID II, CRD4, EMIR, AIFMD2, and it goes on. The second, and around the same time, were developments in data science and cloud computing that offered new ways of solving old problems. Now, RegTech is often viewed as a subset of FinTech, and this makes sense given that it is broadly the use of technology in financial services. And I do see the irony of raising this point during Stockholm FinTech Week, but I would urge caution in only viewing RegTech as a subset of FinTech. There are three key reasons for this. The first is that FinTechs make use of RegTech themselves, so we've got a bit of a Venn diagram problem there. FinTech itself is a brilliant industry comprising disruptive innovators, challenging business models, and using new technologies to serve reach underserved markets. But RegTech is better viewed as an enabler rather than a disruptor. Compliance is not a natural bedfellow to disruption. And the third reason, as already mentioned, is that RegTech is widely used outside of financial services. So we shouldn't limit our definition to just one industry. Having said all that, what RegTech does have in common with FinTech is how it makes use of technology in innovative ways to solve problems. And I'll dive into that in a little bit more detail now. We've developed our own taxonomy to segregate the RegTech market using a problem-oriented method of classification. And whilst the focus is very much on financial services regulatory problems, many of these products also have use cases in other industries. This slide shows our RegTech taxonomy, which comprises 11 categories. The first is financial crime, dealing with helping firms comply with anti-money laundering, fraud detection and counter-terrorism financing legislation. We have regulatory reporting, which is across a wide range of data types, including aggregated capital adequacy and risk management data. Market integrity and transparency, focusing on making sure that we're compliant with the rules around being fair, efficient, and transparent. We have regulation and compliance management. We all know that regulatory change and ongoing compliance monitoring is a critical activity for all regulated firms due to the volume and complexity of the rules with which they must comply and the scale of change. We have cyber identity and privacy, which focuses on helping firms address cybersecurity risks, data protection and data privacy issues, and ensuring the identity of all devices and applications for which the client is responsible are known. Regulatory risk analytics and calculations. These deal with all the aspects of regulation that require firms to perform complex risk calculations, scenarios, and simulations for various purposes: pricing, capital allocation, stress testing, also for the prudential regulatory calculations. Before firms can accurately analyse or report on that data, it needs to be managed effectively. And there's a lot of work to do to improve data quality, understand the lineage of individual data items, and apply best practice data governance principles. That's what we mean by our regulatory information and data management category. We also have environmental, social, and governance, which helps firms by integrating those ESG factors into their middle and back office operations, ensuring compliance with not only regulations, but also many of the internal and external standards that are being set around reporting. We have general compliance. This helps firms address general compliance issues that are either agnostic to specific types of regulation, things like training, marketing compliance, supply chain risk, or cut across regulatory boundaries. We have tax compliance. Products in this category tend to solve problems spanning a number of tax regulations. The OECD Common Reporting Standard and FATCA are just two of those. And then we have a generic other category. And products here tend to focus on other industries or where their technology has a wide range of use cases, and regulatory compliance is just one of those. Now, we know there are several other taxonomies out there, and as anyone who's ever tried to classify anything like this will know, it's much more of an art than a science, and we're continually improving it. So please let me know if you have any feedback. In our current database of nearly 1,200 products, we've split them across these various 11 categories and in the proportions shown in this slide. By far the largest category, as you can see there, 32.8%, are products designed to combat financial crime, incorporating money laundering, terrorist financing, and fraud. These problems are huge and complex for financial institutions, and they're compounded by the acceleration in the adoption of digital channels and the ability of criminals to continually adapt and change how they exploit the financial system for their nefarious ends. The second largest category is cyber identity and privacy at 16.5%. reflecting the many challenges involved in keeping data secure from external threats and ensuring compliance with regulations such as GDPR. And almost tied in third place are market integrity and transparency, and regulation and compliance management are both just shy of 9%. We know that for the former, MiFID II was a huge catalyst for growth in the segment, so it will be very interesting to see how the proposed review of MiFID II and MiFIR will play out and what additional types of solutions may be required. One of the problems that financial institutions face when selecting RegTechs is the sheer number of vendors out there. And if we turn to that nearly 33% of financial crime products and turn that into a landscape of their logos, you can see just how overwhelming those 350 plus products actually are. How do you find the solution that you're looking for? How do firms navigate this fog of innovation? And I'll come back to that later on this morning. Let's look at the market in a little bit more detail and look at the geography of RegTech and the geographic spread of where RegTech companies are headquartered. There are some definite hotspots in the world. North America is leading the way with the largest number, followed by continental Europe, if considered as a whole, and the UK. And this is by the number of products. Now, it may be, and I'm quite willing to admit this, that our data is slightly skewed to the Western world, but we know there are also pockets of excellence elsewhere, most notably in Asia and in Singapore. Unfortunately, Singapore is a little bit too small on this map to even show you, but that there's definitely a lot of activity and development happening in the market in APAC. We also track the maturity of the RegTech market in two ways, generally. The first is simply by the number of RegTechs that were founded per year. And that's the chart you can see here on the left. The peak of the curve is in 2016, which we have labelled peak RegTech. And while the number of new companies founded appears to drop off a cliff after this point in time, we can see, if we look at the second chart, that's because these companies are maturing. We look at the maturity of the market based on putting RegTechs into three age brackets: incumbents, who are more than 10 years old, challengers between 5 and 10 years old, and what we call new kids on the block, less than 5 years old. And you can see that there are fewer new kids now, more challengers and more incumbents as they're moving through the maturity cycle. We can see that globally the market is definitely maturing. We also looked at the RegTechs that we have in our data from the Nordics. We have roughly, I think, 25. And if you look at the split by category, they roughly reflect the overall trend in that the majority are financial crime focused. But we're really keen to make sure our data is representative of the market. So if there are any RegTechs watching here that don't think they're featured in our data, please let me know, because we do want to make sure we've captured everybody. You can also see the Nordic RegTech by age bracket. We have fewer incumbents and challengers and more new kids. And this would be indicative that the market in the Nordics isn't quite perhaps mature as the market globally and in some other jurisdictions, which means there's a huge opportunity for growth, I think, in the RegTech market in the Nordics. So we've touched on the supply side of the market quite a lot, looking at some of the current trends. But what about the demand side? Who's buying RegTech and why? Now, our research shows that banks in particular have been experimenting with RegTech for a while, engaging in proofs of concept and then moving to production contracts. We see a slightly slower push to adopt RegTech in asset management insurance, though for sure this is likely to speed up in the next couple of years. And we shouldn't forget that regulators and supervisors are buyers and users of RegTech, though this has been given a slightly different label, SupTech or supervisory technology. And a recent report by the Financial Stability Board found that more than a third of the supervisory authorities they surveyed had a RegTech strategy, a SupTech strategy already deployed to support their supervisory responsibilities more efficiently and effectively, with a critical focus on the collection, storage and management and analysis of data. And there's a great example of this much closer to home. Indeed, in May 2020, the Swedish Finansinspektionen, I hope I've said that correctly, announced that it has selected Bearing Point's Abacus solution for regulatory reporting to perform a range of data collection and analysis tasks for the EBA, EIOPA and ESMA, the European supervisory authorities, and their reports, as well as different national reports. So that's a great example of how regulators can seem to be leading and demonstrating their own adoption of SupTech or RegTech, leading by example. Now, let's look a little bit more about why firms are using RegTech. What are the benefits? Why would they use RegTech instead of their current systems? Well, the first key benefit is reduction in risk. Reduction in the risk of human error in using manual processes, using multiple spreadsheets for critical compliance operations, processing large amounts of data to identify undetected risks, more robust compliance risk management. Secondly, are the improvements in efficiency and effectiveness, largely through the automation of repeatable, standardized tasks. Thinking about client onboarding, for example, there's a lot of repeatable manual tasks that can be automated, and that releases people to focus on the more high-value tasks involving analysis and decision-making, using some of the data thrown up by that automation to make decisions, to investigate, to use judgment. Efficiency through dealing better with things like false positive alerts or reducing times to investigate problems in trade surveillance. There have been some estimates that 5% of revenue annually is spent on compliance from the Duff and Phelps survey. If we could even move that needle by 0.5 percentage point, that would be a significant cost saving. And also added on top of that, the efficiency and effectiveness gains will also feed the bottom line. And finally, one of the benefits that's often mentioned is that when you have all of that data together, when you have that extra efficiency and effectiveness, layering on top new and analytical methods and with cloud computing and APIs, you can start joining structured and unstructured data sets together that you never could before. And you can get additional insights from that, both in terms of compliance, but also more generally in terms of customer behavior. One great example of this is pulling together your trade surveillance data with your e-commerce recording data and gaining greater insights into your market surveillance and potential nefarious activity going on there. So what does the future of RegTech look like? As I mentioned, the genesis of the current RegTech market lay partly in the wave of regulatory change following the financial crisis, which primarily focused on mitigating systemic risks, addressing market inefficiencies and conduct issues. So where are the next big regulatory changes likely to come from that will drive innovation in the RegTech market? Well, we think there's two potential areas of growth which will follow moves towards stricter regulation. The first is sustainability, what we've categorized as environmental, social and governance, and the increasing regulation around financial disclosures, for example, in that space. And the second, we think, will be around the increasing regulatory strictness around digital assets. Now, I'll focus just on ESG. I don't really have time today to do digital assets regulation justice. That's something for another time. But thinking about ESG, amid concerns about so-called greenwashing and sustainable finance and ESG investing, regulators globally have started the process of introducing standardization and regulation on the issue of sustainability, One example is the EU's Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, and this has fed through to a number of regulatory changes in the EU, some of which come into effect this year, particularly the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which mandates disclosure requirements on primarily on the E part of ESG, and they're probably just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the EU regulation, which also includes the EU Taxonomy, a regulation designed to clarify what economic activities can be considered to be environmentally sustainable that should then feed through into all financial disclosures. This regulation sits alongside a slew of soft law reporting standards, including the Task Force on climate-related financial disclosures, the UN's Principles for Responsible Investment, all the way through to national codes for sustainability. It's an incredibly complex landscape and one which relies on a plethora of data. We've actively been tracking RegTech developments in this market in response to these regulatory changes. And last year, we added ESG as a top-level category to our taxonomy. So we researched about 100 products or vendors in this category, and you can see some of them there on the market map. And we discovered that solutions in this sector covered a number of different use cases. One of the largest is the integration of all types of ESG data, from ratings through to carbon emissions, into the entire investment life cycle. They cover things like emissions monitoring, reporting and disclosure, and also layering on top of that a lot of analytics and insight. And there's some risk and compliance type products in there as well. So these are solutions for socially responsible investing, corporate social responsibility, ESG. But this market's relatively immature and dominated by several large and well-established providers, such as Bloomberg, MSCI, and NASDAQ, and those providing ESG related data and analytics, S&P, FactSet, Moody's. And we've talked already before about how RegTech is a conversation we see happening across many sectors. And I think sustainability and ESG is a really good example of where the opportunity for RegTech isn't just necessarily within FS. All of those corporates that are having to disclose ESG measures might well be able to make use of some of these RegTech solutions out there. Having said this about the current market and the future areas of growth such as ESG, we still believe there's a lot to be done to increase the adoption of RegTech by regulated firms and to really move RegTech into the mainstream. We don't think it's yet reached that crucial tipping point where all regulated firms have a RegTech strategy and are actively using RegTech as a core part of their compliance technology infrastructure. And we see that there are three main reasons for this. The first is that there's a bit of a trust and awareness gap between three key sets of actors in the market: regulators, regulated firms, and vendors. The second reason within regulated firms is that there are often organizational and cultural barriers within financial institutions, things like legacy technology, long and labyrinthine procurement cycles, and a lack of perceived business case to RegTech. Now, that's not to say that those are common to every financial institution. We know there are some brilliant supporters and adopters of RegTech out there, but this is something generally that we see across the market. One of the final barriers to adoption, if you like, is the lack of standardization in terms of data standards and regulatory rules that would really be a building block to creating that digitally enabled regulatory system that was part of Andrew Haldane's vision. To tackle that gap in trust and awareness, all three groups of actors need to do a better job, I think, of articulating their role in the ecosystem. Regulators need to be really clear about what they can do to support RegTech within the boundaries of their mandates. RegTechs themselves need to therefore understand that regulators can't act like dating agencies. They're not there to introduce your solution to a particular financial institution. They're there to oversee the safety and soundness of the financial system. RegTechs are their own best advocates and should shout more loudly about the concrete and real benefits they're delivering for their customers. Financial institutions need to be more aware and understand those benefits and find better ways of articulating them internally as a must-have rather than a could-have, particularly to their senior management and their boards. And then vendors, in turn, need to understand and work with financial institutions to make sure that they really, really, really get the problems that need fixing. There are already, though, some brilliant examples of how, by working more closely together, financial institutions, regulators, and vendors can really tackle these seemingly intractable challenges. And there's a fantastic case study right here in the Nordics, which is Invidem. This is the KYC utility founded by 6 Nordic banks. By agreeing on a set of common standards for KYC information, and it now provides a trustworthy pooled data set that these banks and others can use for their KYC processes. Invidem is powered by RegTech technology. We know that there are 2 brilliant technologies in there from our financial crime sector, iMeta and Encompass. So you can see the vendors and the financial institutions have come together to create something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And there are several other really great examples of cross-industry collaboration. I'd highlight the FCA and Bank of England's digital regulatory reporting, which really demonstrated the art of the possible when the power of RegTech is explored and deployed. This work was also really important in highlighting the need for data standardization to remove the burden of rule interpretation from individual regulated institutions and having really clear definitions of the data items required for regulatory reporting. This pilot also explored how new technologies such as distributed ledger technology could be used in the future for regulatory reporting, opening up the possibility of real-time regulatory reporting and therefore even real-time regulatory monitoring from a Star Trek seat. And we're back to that future vision for RegTech. And I'm going to leave you with one final quote, which I think really encapsulates the future potential of RegTech. This is from an academic article by Arnold Barbaras and Buckley from 2016. And they say, RegTech represents more than just an efficiency tool and is rather a pivotal change leading to a paradigm shift in regulation. Viewed holistically, RegTech represents the next logical evolution of financial services regulation and should develop into a foundational base underpinning the entire financial services sector. Realising this and Andrew Haldane's vision is possible. There are some challenges to overcome, but by pulling together, we can hopefully build a sustainable RegTech industry and one that will benefit us all by keeping the financial system safe and sound.